The notification came through at 03:47 hours, and Elena Vargas read it 3 times before she believed it. She sat on the edge of her bunk in the Titan Academy barracks, her duffel bag packed and ready for what she had assumed would be a quiet assignment to the 9th Humanitarian Relief Corps, where she would patch up wounded colonists and hand out ration packs on frontier worlds, and where the most dangerous thing she would face would be a bacterial infection or a paper cut. Instead, her deployment orders read, Division Ikrath 9, Outpost Fang, Asteroid Belt, Kara 7. Division Ikrath 9, the Monster Division. She pulled up the division's file on her datapad and scrolled through it with growing horror, reading the names of species she had only ever seen in threat assessment textbooks, species that professors used as examples when teaching cadets what to avoid on hostile worlds, species that gave other predators nightmares. Vralkeen, 8-limbed killing machines wrapped in natural chitin armor that could stop a plasma round, standing 3 meters tall with jaws that could bite through starship hull plating. The Draconi, serpentine and ancient, their bodies burning with internal furnaces that let them spit superheated plasma from glands in their throats. The Gorvathi, 6-eyed pack hunters built like battering rams, their bones so dense that they could charge through a concrete wall and keep running. The Nytheri, shadow dwellers who could phase partially out of visible light, ambush predators who killed you before you even knew they were in the room. And now, somehow, one human combat medic. Elena checked the transfer code again and found the error buried in the system, a taxonomic database glitch during a routine update that had briefly reclassified Homo sapiens under a subcategory labeled Class 7 Apex Predators before the correction was applied. Sorting system had already processed her file and stamped her orders. She filed a transfer request immediately and received an automated response that made her stomach drop. All reassignment requests required 6 standard cycles to process, which meant 6 months, which meant she was stuck. The shuttle to Outpost Fang was cold and empty, and Elena spent the 12-hour journey reading everything she could find about the Monster Division, which was not much, because most of it was classified, and the parts that were not classified were mostly composed of casualty reports from the things they had been sent to kill. Outpost Fang looked exactly the way it sounded, a jagged structure embedded in a cluster of asteroids, like a tooth in a broken jaw, all dark metal and sharp angles, and docking bays that looked like open mouths waiting to swallow her whole. When the shuttle doors opened, the smell hit her first, a thick animal musk, layered with ozone and something sweet, rotten, that she could not identify. The collective scent of a dozen apex predator species living in close quarters. The docking bay was enormous, built to accommodate creatures far larger than any human, and Elena felt like a child, walking through a cathedral, as she stepped out with her duffel bag over one shoulder and her medkit over the other. They were waiting for her. A Vralkeen stood closest to the ramp, all 8 limbs folded in what Elena's training told her was a posture of casual contempt, its compound eyes reflecting her image back at her 100 times over, each reflection tiny and fragile. Behind it, a Dracony coiled around a support pillar, heat shimmering off its scales, watching her with slit-pupiled eyes that glowed like embers in a dying fire. 2 Gorvathi flanked the corridor entrance, their 6 eyes tracking her movements with the patient focus of creatures that were used to chasing things until those things collapsed. Shadows between the overhead lights. Something shifted and flickered that Elena knew was a Nytheri, even though she could barely see it. She straightened her spine and walked forward, because there was nothing else to do. The division commander met her in the briefing room, and Warlord Rethka Gorvathi was everything Elena had feared and more. A massive creature, nearly 3 meters tall, with a scarred hide that looked like a topographic map of every battle she had ever fought. 6 eyes arranged in 2 rows of 3 that all focused on Elena, with an intensity that made her feel like a specimen on a slide. "There has been a mistake," Rethka said, her voice a deep rumble that Elena felt in her chest cavity. "Yes, Warlord," Elena said, keeping her voice steady through sheer force of will. "I have already filed for reassignment." 6 months, Rethka said, and there was something in her tone that might have been amusement, if amusement could sound like grinding. "Stone." Elena nodded. "Then for 6 months, you are mine," Rethka said, leaning forward until Elena could see her own reflection in all 6 of those enormous dark eyes. "Try not to die, small thing. The paperwork for losing a human is extensive." They gave her the lowest role in the division, supply runner and field tagger, which meant she would carry equipment that was too unimportant for anyone else to bother with, and mark targets with tracking beacons so that the real hunters could find and kill them. And everyone understood without saying it that her job placed her close enough to danger to be useful and close enough to death to be disposable. Her bunkmate was a Nithari named Sketh, who was the division's runt at barely 2 meters tall and who phased in and out of visibility when he was nervous, which seemed to be most of the time, and who was only slightly less of an outsider than Elena herself. "They put us together because we are both mistakes," told her on her first night, his voice a whisper made of rustling silk, and Elena could not tell if he was being cruel or kind, and she decided it did not matter. She spent her first week learning the layout of the outpost, memorizing patrol routes, studying the species profiles of her squadmates with the same clinical attention she had once given to anatomy textbooks, noting which ones moved with pain they were hiding, and which ones favored certain limbs, and which ones had old wounds that had healed badly. She was a medic, and a medic's first job was to see what others ignored. On the 8th day, they took her on an orientation patrol to a desolate moon with no atmosphere and a surface made of gray dust and black rock, and the squad moved through the terrain like gods of destruction, the Vralkeens smashing through rock formations, the Gorvathi sprinting across open ground, the Nithari vanishing and reappearing like bad dreams. Elena walked behind them all, slow and measured, small and quiet, and she looked at the ground. She saw tracks, not the tracks of the creatures they were cataloging for the patrol exercise, but something else, something pressed deep into the dust, with a weight and a stride pattern that did not match anything in the Coalition bestiary. Something with too many limbs that moved in a gait she had never seen described in any textbook. She knelt and measured the depth of the impression with her fingers, and calculated the mass required to make it, and felt something cold settle in her stomach. She tagged the coordinates on her datapad and said nothing to anyone, because she was just the supply runner, and nobody would listen. But she saved the data, because Elena Vargas was a human being, and human beings did not ignore the feeling that something was watching them from the dark. That feeling had kept her species alive for 100,000 years. She was not about to stop trusting it now. The persistence of the soft thing. The jungle world of Varath Hollow was a place that seemed designed to kill everything that entered it, and Elena hated it the moment she stepped off the dropship. The air was so thick with fog that she could barely see 10 meters ahead, and the humidity was so intense that water condensed on every surface within minutes. The trees were not really trees, but towering columns of dark, flesh-like plant matter that pulsed faintly as if they had heartbeats, and the ground was soft and wet and tried to swallow her boots with every step. The colonial settlement of Varath Station had gone silent 3 weeks ago. 47 souls who had stopped answering communications, and whose last transmission had been a single word repeated over and over: running. The monster division deployed in full strength, 12 operators including Elena. The mood as they entered the jungle was one of bored confidence, because this was what they did, and they were the best at it, and nothing on this backwater world could possibly challenge them. Elena watched them move through the fog like living weapons, the Vralkeen crashing through undergrowth with their armored bodies, the Draconi slithering between the tree columns with heat rolling off their scales, Rethka leading the Gorvathi in a wide patrol arc with the easy authority of a predator who had never once in her life been afraid. And then the jungle began to fight back. The fog disrupted the Nithari first, because their phasing ability relied on manipulating light frequencies, and the dense moisture scattered light in ways that made their camouflage flicker and fail, leaving Sketh and the other Nithari visible and exposed and deeply uncomfortable. The humidity attacked the Vralkeen next, seeping into the joints of their chitin armor and softening the outer layers until movement became painful. And within 6 hours, the 2 Vralkeen in the squad were moving at half speed, and cursing in languages Elena's translator could barely process. The Draconi handled the moisture well enough, but the dense terrain gave them no room to maneuver, and a serpentine predator that could not coil and strike was a serpentine predator that was mostly just a very large target. Even Rethka and the Gorvathi struggled, because their pack-hunting style required open ground and clear sightlines, and the jungle gave them neither. Elena was miserable in the way that all humans were miserable in hostile environments, which was to say she was wet and tired, and her feet hurt, and her pack was heavy, and she wanted very badly to sit down, but she did not sit down because there was nowhere to sit, and so she kept walking. She had been walking for 14 hours when Sketh appeared beside her, his shadow form rippling with exhaustion, and he stared at her with eyes like chips of black glass. "How are you still moving?" he asked, and it was not really a question, but something closer to an accusation. "Humans are persistence hunters," Elena told him, while adjusting the strap of her pack without slowing her pace. "We do not need to be the fastest thing in the jungle. We just need to be the thing that does not stop." Sketh said nothing to that, but he stayed close to her after, and Elena could feel him watching her with a new kind of attention. They found the first bodies on the second day, colonists who had not made it to the emergency bunker. Their remains scattered across a clearing in a pattern that Elena recognized from her xenobiology courses as a feeding display, which meant the predator was not just eating, but marking territory and warning other predators away. The squad tracked the creature for another 6 hours before it found them first. The Valgaroth came out of the fog like a nightmare given muscle and bone, a Category 9 megafauna predator the size of a small shuttle with a body built for ambush, killing, all dense muscle and razor-edge limbs, and a mouth that opened in 4 directions at once. It hit the squad's left flank before anyone could react, and crippled both Vralkeen in the first 3 seconds, smashing through their softened chitin with limbs that moved faster than anything that size had any right to move. And then it turned on the nearest Draconi and nearly tore him in half before Rethka charged it from the side and drove it back. The fight lasted 90 seconds, and the Valgaroth won by simply leaving when it decided to, vanishing into the fog with a speed that left the squad bleeding and stunned. Elena went to work. She had the medkit open before the Valgaroth's footsteps had faded, and she moved between the wounded with a calm efficiency that later the aliens would describe to each other in terms usually reserved for things that frightened them. She put her hands inside of Vralkeen's chest cavity, where the chitin had been shattered, and the soft tissue beneath was torn and bleeding. And she clamped arteries and sealed vascular walls with biofoam, while the Vralkeen screamed and thrashed, and she did not flinch, because flinching would mean her patient would die, and Elena did not lose patience if she could help it. The wounded Draconi was harder, because his blood was superheated, and it burned her gloves and the skin beneath. But she worked through the pain with her teeth clenched and her hands steady, until the bleeding stopped, and the alien's eyes focused on her, with something she had never seen a Draconi direct at a human before. something that looked very much like respect. When the wounded were stable, Rethka called the squad together and announced they would set a trap for the Valgorath, a standard ambush pattern using the Gorvathi as bait, and the remaining combat-capable members as the killing force. Elena studied the blood trail and the tracks, and the pattern of the attack, and the direction of the track. Retreat? And something about it nagged at her. Something wrong. And she ran the numbers in her head the way she ran diagnostic algorithms in the field, checking and rechecking until she was sure. "It is not retreating," she said quietly to Sketh. "It attacked from the west, but its territory markers are to the east, and the colonial bunker is to the east, which means it is not running from us. It is circling back to the survivors. It is using them as bait to draw us into a second ambush." Sketh stared at her and asked if she was certain, and Elena said she was, and Sketh asked if she had told Rethka, and Elena said she had tried, but Rethka was not listening to the supply runner. "Then what will you do?" Sketh asked. "I am going to follow it," Elena said, and she shouldered her pack and checked her field tagger and walked into the fog. Sketh followed her because he could not explain even to himself why he would let this small soft creature go alone into the breeze-in. Dark. Elena tracked the Valgorath for 19 hours through the jungle without stopping, reading broken branches and displaced soil and the faint chemical traces it left behind that her portable scanner could barely detect, eating ration bars while she walked, and drinking water from her canteen without slowing down, her legs burning and her vision blurring and her body screaming at her to stop, and she did not stop. She found it exactly where she had predicted, crouched in the fog outside the entrance to the colonial bunker, where the surviving settlers were hiding, its body positioned to strike at anything that came to rescue them. She could not kill it because she was a medic with a sidearm, and it was a creature that had crippled 3 apex predators in 90 seconds. But she did not need to kill it. She activated her field tagger and painted the Valgorath with a targeting beacon that would broadcast its position to every member of the squad, and then she pulled a sonic emitter from her medkit and set it to a frequency she had calculated from the creature's own vocalizations during the first attack, a sound that mimicked a wounded juvenile of its species. The Valgorath hesitated and turned toward the sound, confused and curious, and that hesitation was all Elena needed. The monster division arrived 11 minutes later, following the beacon, and Rethka delivered the killing blow with a strike that shattered the creature's skull, and the jungle fell silent. Elena sat down on the wet ground because her legs would no longer support her, and she shook with exhaustion so deep it felt like her bones were vibrating. Rethka stood over her, 6 eyes blinking one after another, and looked down at this small broken human who had walked for 19 hours through a jungle that had defeated apex predators. And she asked a question in a voice that no one in the division had ever heard her use before. "How long can you keep going without sleep?" Elena looked up at her and said, "My record is 4 days." Rethka's eyes blinked again, slowly, all 6 of them, and for the first time in her very long and very violent life, the warlord of Division Ikrath 9 felt something she had never felt toward a prey species. She felt afraid. What humans are. Word spread through the coalition fleet the way all good stories spread, fast and loud, and with details that grew larger with every retelling, and within a month, every soldier in 3 sectors knew the story of the human woman who had out-tracked the monster division on Vareth Hollow. Elena's transfer request was denied, and this time it was not because of bureaucratic delays, but because Warlord Rethka had personally contacted Coalition Command and blocked it with a message that simply read, "The human stays, she is mine now, do not ask again." Elena was promoted to a rank that had never existed before in the Monster Division, Field Tracker First Class, because the division had never needed a tracker, because they had always assumed their own predatory instincts were the sharpest tools available, and because no one had ever shown them they were wrong, until a small human with a medkit and a stubborn refusal to sit down had walked through a jungle for 19 hours and found something they could not. She began to change the way the division fought, not by replacing their instincts, but by giving them something to build on. And the change started with a simple question she asked Rethka one morning in the briefing room. "How do you decide what to hunt?" Rethka had looked at her as if the question made no sense, and said, "We hunt what needs to be killed." "But how do you find it?" Elena pressed. "How do you know where it will be tomorrow, or what it will do when it is cornered, or whether it is alone, or part of a pack, or whether it is the real threat, or just a distraction?" Rethka had no answer for that, because Rethka had never needed one. And in the silence that followed, Elena began to teach. She introduced them to pattern recognition across behavioral data, showing them how to build profiles of prey species based on feeding cycles and territorial movements and reproductive timing. Hunters who had always relied on their speed and their noses suddenly had a map of their prey's entire life laid out before them like a battle plan. She taught them wound analysis for predictive tracking, showing them how the way a creature bled and the way it favored its injuries could tell you exactly where it would go and how fast it would get there. And the Draconi, who had always simply chased their prey until they caught it, began to arrive at the destination before the prey did. She taught them psychological profiling, the idea that every creature had patterns of thought and behavior that could be read and predicted if you knew what to look for. And the Nytheri, who had always been ambush predators, began to set traps that were so perfectly placed their targets walked into them willingly. Mission after mission, Elena proved her value in ways that made the division rethink everything they knew about hunting. On an ice world called Grethis IV, a burrowing predator had been destroying mining equipment and killing workers, and the division had spent 3 days searching the frozen tunnels without finding it, until Elena noticed that the thermal vents on the surface were not distributed randomly, but in a pattern that matched the creature's body heat, and she mapped its position from above without ever entering the tunnels. And the Vralkeen dropped through the ice directly on top of it. On a Coalition space station, they were sent to eliminate a Vreth that had broken containment from a research lab, and Elena stopped the squad from killing it by recognizing that its body language was not aggressive, but defensive. The hunched posture and the spread limbs and the low vibrations it was producing were all signs of a creature protecting something, and she searched the area behind it and found a clutch of eggs hidden in an air vent, and she talked the Vreth down by slowly and carefully moving the eggs to a safe container. Tones and a potential diplomatic disaster with the Vreth Confederacy was avoided because a human medic knew what a scared mother looked like. During a night hunt on a jungle moon, she designed a system of reflective markers and tripwire alarms that channeled a pack of predators twice her size into a narrow kill zone where the division was waiting, and the aliens watched in amazement as this creature who weighed less than any of their arms herded 20 beasts to their deaths using nothing but light and string and an understanding of how fear worked. The division began to see Elena differently, not as a mistake or a mascot or a curiosity, but as something none of them had a word for in their own languages, something that was not a predator and not prey, but something else entirely, something that looked at the universe with eyes that saw patterns where instinct only saw targets. Sketh explained it best, speaking to a new Draconi recruit who had asked why everyone in the division followed a human's advice. "The Vralkeen are better armored," Sketh said in his whispering silk voice. "We Nytheri are better at stealth. The Gorvathi are faster. The Draconi are more powerful. But none of us can do what she does. She looks at a world she has never seen and a creature she has never fought, and in an hour she knows more about it than we learn in a season. And then she walks after it until it is dead or gives up, and nothing in this galaxy gives up less than a human." Elena also changed the division in ways that had nothing to do with hunting. She introduced them to campfire culture, a human tradition that confused them at first, because sitting in a circle and eating together and telling stories seemed like a waste of time, better spent sleeping or sharpening weapons. But she insisted, and slowly the division began to participate. Rethka told stories of her first kills with a pride that made the younger hunters sit up straighter, and the Vralkeen shared battle songs in deep vibrating tones that Elena felt in her teeth. And Sketh told ghost stories from the Nytheri shadow worlds that made everyone uncomfortable in a way they secretly enjoyed. And Elena told jokes that nobody understood but everyone laughed at because her delivery was so earnest. For the first time in its history, Division Ikrath 9 began to feel less like a collection of predators who fought together, and more like a family. And nobody was more surprised by this than Rethka, who had commanded the division for 20 years and had never once thought of her soldiers as anything other than weapons. But not everyone was pleased. Within the coalition's political structure, a faction of species who had always resented the monster division's autonomy and feared their power saw Elena's success as an opportunity rather than an achievement. And they began to whisper in the halls of the High Assembly that if a human could thrive in division. Ikrath 9. Then perhaps the division was not as elite as it claimed, and perhaps it should be restructured and brought under tighter control, and perhaps it should be disbanded entirely. Elena did not know about the politics, because Elena was a soldier and not a diplomat. But she learned fast. She was in the communications hub late one night, running data analysis on a new prey species, when a classified transmission passed through the system with a routing error that placed a copy in the general queue for 3 seconds before the encryption caught up and pulled it back. But 3 seconds was enough for Elena to read it. Coalition intelligence had detected a hollow signal, a transmission pattern that the database flagged with the highest possible threat classification, a pattern associated with the Kethrani, a species of apex predators that had been classified as extinct for over 800 years after they had consumed an entire galactic arm before being stopped by a coalition of species that no longer existed. The signal was coming from the Ashenmaw Rift, a region of dead space at the edge of the galaxy where no ship had returned from in centuries. And the order attached to the signal was simple and cold. Deploy Division Ikrath 9 to investigate. Full combat complement. No support, no backup, no extraction plan. Elena read it twice and understood what it meant. Someone in high command wanted the monster division to walk into the dark and never come back, and they were using the Kethrani as the knife. She closed the file and sat in the dark for a long time, and then she went to find Rethka, because if they were going to die, they were going to die knowing why. Into the Ashenmaw. The Ashenmaw Rift was not a place, it was an absence, a wound in the galaxy where stars had been and now were not, where planets had orbited and now drifted as dead husks stripped of every living molecule, where the light itself seemed tired and thin as if it had given up trying to illuminate things that no longer wanted to be seen. The assault carrier Fang of Rethka entered the rift on a Tuesday by human reckoning, and by Wednesday the crew knew they were in trouble. Navigation systems began reporting positions that were impossible, placing the ship simultaneously in 2 locations separated by light years, and the sensors returned readings that the science officer described as screaming before he corrected himself and said interference in a voice that fooled nobody. Elena stood on the observation deck and watched the dead worlds drift past the viewports, gray and smooth and wrong in a way that took her several hours to identify. When she finally understood what she was seeing, she felt her stomach drop, because the planets had not been destroyed. They had been consumed. Their surfaces scraped clean of every organic compound, down to the bare rock, as if something impossibly large and impossibly hungry had licked them clean. They found the derelict science vessel Meridian on the 3rd day, a coalition research ship that had been sent into the rift 6 months earlier, on a classified mission that nobody in the division had been told about. The meridian was intact but dark, and when the boarding team forced the airlock and entered, they found the crews still at their stations, dead in their chairs, with expressions on their faces that Elena wished she could forget. Not pain or violence, but exhaustion and terror so complete that their bodies had simply stopped, hearts giving out under the weight of a fear so profound it had become a physical force. The ship's logs told the story. The research team had found the Kethrani, or rather the Kethrani had found them. And what they had discovered before they died had been important enough to record, even as their bodies were shutting down. The Kethrani were not extinct. They had been hibernating, drifting in the dark spaces between dead worlds, in a state of biological suspension that could last millennia, waiting for the signal that would wake them. And the hollow signal that Coalition intelligence had detected was not a distress call or a communication. It was a reproductive beacon, a wake-up call broadcast from a hive nexus somewhere deep in the rift, telling every dormant Kethrani swarm in the galaxy that it was time to feed again. But the worst part was what the Kethrani were. The science team had managed to capture and study a single juvenile specimen before it killed 3 of them and escaped, and their findings were devastating. The Kethrani were bioadaptive apex predators that could evolve in real time, counter any threat they encountered, their cellular structure rewriting itself at a speed that made natural selection look like a leisurely stroll. And every species that had ever fought them had been specifically counter-adapted against within minutes of first contact. Armor made them grow acid, speed made them grow faster, stealth made them develop sonar. Every weapon became a lesson, and every lesson made them deadlier. Elena read the report, and then read it again, and then sat down and put her head in her hands, because she understood now why the division had been sent here without backup. Not just to die, but to fail. Because if the Kethrani adapted to the monster division's apex predators, the resulting super predators would be Coalition High Command's justification for a full military mobilization that would consolidate power in the hands of the political faction that wanted control. But if the division somehow succeeded, the Kethrani threat would be eliminated. The problem would solve itself either way. They made contact on the 5th day. The Kethrani came out of the dark like a tide of living blades, hundreds of them pouring from the surface of a dead moon in forms that shifted and changed as they moved, their bodies a nightmare of adaptation and hunger. And the monster division met them with everything they had. It was not enough. The Kethrani adapted to Vralkeen chitin in 4 minutes, growing molecular edged appendages that sliced through armor like paper. And the 2 Vralkeen warriors who had survived Varith Hollow were down and bleeding before they could retreat. They countered Nithiri phasing in 6 minutes, developing a vibration sense that detected the shadow hunters even when they were invisible. And Sketh barely escaped with his life when 3 Kethrani tracked him through a phase shift and nearly tore him apart. They resisted Draconi plasma in 8 minutes, growing heat-ablative skin that shed thermal energy like water off stone, and the Draconi's most powerful weapons became useless. The Gorvathi lasted longest because their strategy was simple and their bodies were hard to break. But even Rethka was driven back, her hide torn in a dozen places, her left foreleg hanging useless, her 6 eyes wide with an emotion that Elena had never seen in them before: fear. The monster division retreated to the fang of Rethka, and sealed the airlocks, and counted their wounded and their dead. And for the first time in the division's history, the most dangerous predators in the galaxy sat in silence and tried to understand what it felt like to be prey. Elena moved among them, treating wounds and setting bones and sealing gashes. And she worked with the same calm efficiency she always showed, but inside her mind was racing, because she had seen something in the Kethrani's behavior that the others had not, something that their predator instincts would not let them see, because they had never needed to see it before. The Kithrani adapted to specific threats. They evolved to counter what they encountered, which meant their adaptation was reactive, not creative. It was biological pattern matching of the highest order. But it was still just pattern matching. And pattern matching had a weakness. You could not adapt to something that refused to be a pattern. Elena called a briefing and stood in front of creatures that could kill her with a careless gesture. Creatures who were wounded and afraid and looking at her with eyes that held a desperate hope she was not sure she deserved. And she laid out her plan. She called it the persistence doctrine. Stop being what they expect, she told them, her voice steady, even though her hands were shaking behind her back. Every one of you fights the same way every time, because you are predators, and predators have methods that work, and you use them. But the Kithrani eat methods, tactics, and excrete counter-tactics, and if you keep being what you are, they will keep evolving to kill what you are. She reorganized the division into mixed-species fire teams that would rotate tactics on a randomized schedule, never attacking the same way twice, alternating between weapons and traps and environmental hazards and retreats and advances that followed no pattern because there was no pattern to follow. Be chaotic, she said. Be irrational. Be unpredictable. Be the thing that evolution cannot prepare for. Be a mind that refuses to be categorized. Rethka asked her how she knew this would work, and Elena looked at her and said, because this is how humans have survived everything. We are not the strongest or the fastest or the toughest species in the galaxy, but we are the ones that change. We became different every time the world tried to kill us, and the world never caught up. The second engagement was different. The mixed fire teams hit the Kithrani from angles that made no tactical sense, using combinations of attacks that no sane strategist would recommend. A Vralkeen charging alongside a Nithari, while a Drakani provided covering fire from a position that was technically behind their own lines, followed by a retreat in a direction that led deeper into enemy territory, followed by an ambush from a location the team had already abandoned. The Kithrani adapted to each attack, but by the time the adaptation was complete, the attack had changed, and they adapted again, and it changed again. And for the first time in their existence, the Kithrani's greatest weapon became their greatest weakness, because they were spending so much energy evolving that they could not focus on fighting. Elena led the final strike team into the Hive Nexus herself, a pulsing organic structure buried beneath the dead moon's surface that broadcast a hollow signal through subspace, and they planted fusion charges in its core, while the Kithrani Queen waited in the deepest chamber. The Queen was ancient and enormous, and had adapted to everything the galaxy had ever thrown at her, and she blocked the only exit with a body that filled the corridor like a wall of living razors. Elena told the team to go and find another way out, and they argued, and she told them again in a voice that left no room for debate. And Sketh was the last to leave, his dark eyes holding hers for a moment that said everything neither of them had words for. Elena faced the Queen alone with a flare in one hand and a knife in the other, and she did the only thing a human could do against a creature that had evolved to counter gods. She ran. She ran and dodged and bled and screamed, and the Queen chased her through the tunnels of the hive, adapting with every second, growing faster and sharper and more deadly. But Elena kept changing direction, kept doing things that made no sense, kept being the one variable the Queen's calculations couldn't match, biology could not solve, and she held it for 7 minutes. 7 minutes of pure terror and pain, and the desperate, stubborn refusal to die that was the oldest and most human thing in the universe. Sketh detonated the charges remotely. The Hive Nexus collapsed, and the signal died, and the Kithrani swarms across the galaxy never received the wake-up call, and somewhere in the rubble a small broken human lay still. Rethka found her, digging through the debris with all 6 limbs, until she uncovered Elena's body, burned and shattered, but breathing, still breathing, because humans did not stop. The warlord picked her up with a gentleness that would have shocked anyone who knew her. cradling Elena in her arms like something infinitely precious. And Elena opened her eyes and looked up and whispered through blood and dust, "Did we get it?" And Rethka, warlord of Division Ikrath 9, commander of monsters, apex predator of an apex predator species, wept for them, first time in her life, and said, yes, the monster they chose to be. Elena Vargas spent 3 months in a Coalition medical facility on Station Kepler 7, and every single day of those 3 months was a war she fought lying down. Her ribs had been shattered in 11 places, and the fragments had torn through muscle and tissue in patterns that made the surgeons shake their heads before they began the long work of rebuilding her from the inside out. Her left lung had been punctured twice and had to be regrown from stem cultures that itched in a way she could feel deep in her chest, like a second heartbeat that was not quite in sync with the first. Burns covered 40% of her body, and the regeneration treatments healed the skin, but left scars that the doctors offered to remove. Elena told them to leave the scars where they were, and the Gorvathi medical liaison who was present at the time nodded with a respect so deep it was almost reverence, because among the Gorvathi, scars were a language, and Elena's body now told a story that any predator in the galaxy could read. Sketh visited every day, phasing through the hospital wall because he refused to use the door. He would sit in the corner of her room in his shadow form and say nothing for hours, and Elena found his silence more comforting than any words could have been. Rethka visited once a week, filling the doorway with her massive frame and standing with a stillness that Elena had learned to recognize as the Gorvathi expression of deep emotion. She would look at Elena with all 6 of her eyes and say something brief, like, "You are healing," or "The division waits," and then leave. Each time she left, Elena noticed that the warlord walked a little slower past her door, as if she did not want to go. The political faction that had tried to use the Kethrani mission to destroy the Monster Division had gone very quiet, because the division had not only survived, but had saved the galaxy from a threat that would have consumed billions, and the evidence of the conspiracy had been pulled from the Meridian's logs and presented to the Coalition Security Council by Rethka herself, who had delivered it with a calm that everyone in the room understood was more dangerous than anger. 3 officials were removed from their positions, and 2 more resigned before they could be questioned, and the Monster Division's autonomy was not only preserved, but expanded, and nobody in the Coalition's political structure would challenge it again for a very long time. On the 91st day of her recovery, Elena received a summons that made her sit up in her hospital bed and read the message 4 times. She was being called before the Coalition High Assembly. The High Assembly chamber was the largest enclosed space Elena had ever entered, a vast circular arena carved from the heart of a small moon, with seating tiers that rose hundreds of meters on every side, filled with representatives from over 300 species, and the air was thick with the scents and sounds and electromagnetic signatures of creatures so diverse that the environmental systems had to maintain 17 different atmospheric zones simultaneously. Elena walked to the central platform on legs that still ached, wearing her Division Ikrath 9 uniform with the new rank insignia on her collar that she had not yet had time to examine closely. And she stood under the lights and looked up at 300 species looking down at her and felt very small and very human. The assembly speaker, a Threllian whose voice resonated through a crystalline vocal apparatus that filled the chamber with harmonics, asked her to explain in her own words how a human, a species classified as mid-tier in the Coalition's biological rankings, had accomplished what she had accomplished. Elena stood in silence for a moment, and then she spoke, and her voice was not loud, but the acoustics of the chamber carried it to every ear and audio receptor and vibration-sensitive membrane in the room. You classified my species as mid-tier, because we are not the strongest, or the fastest, or the toughest, or the most lethal species in this galaxy. And you are right. We are none of those things. She paused and looked around the chamber at the assembled faces and forms, and she continued. But you made a mistake in your sorting algorithm. You measured what we are, and you should have measured what we are willing to become. The chamber was silent. 300 species holding their breath, or its equivalent. Humans are not apex predators. We are something that your classification system does not have a category for. We are the species that looked at apex predators and said, I can take that. And then we did. Not because we were built for it, but because we decided to be. Every single morning we woke up, and chose to be dangerous in a universe that wanted us dead. The Vralkeen delegation, 12 armored giants watching her with compound eyes. Every monster in Division Ikrath 9 was born dangerous. The Vralkeen were born with armor. The Draconi were born with fire. The Gorvathi were born with speed and strength. The Nytheri were born with shadows. She touched the scars on her arms, visible below her rolled sleeves. I was born with skin that tears if you look at it wrong. I was born with no claws, no armor, no venom, no camouflage. I was born as the softest and most breakable thing on a world full of things that wanted to eat me. Her voice did not waver, and I had to choose every single day to walk into the dark anyway. I had to choose to be afraid and fight anyway. I had to choose to bleed and keep moving, to break and keep standing, to face things that were bigger and stronger and faster and meaner than me, and refuse to lie down. She let the silence hold for a beat. That is what makes humans the scariest thing in this galaxy. We are not monsters by nature. We are monsters by will. And there is nothing in the universe more dangerous than a creature that chooses to be what it is. Because you cannot breed it out of us. You cannot evolve past it. You cannot adapt to counter it. Because it is not biology. It is a decision. And we make it every single day we open our eyes. The silence that followed was so complete that Elena could hear the hum of the environmental systems cycling through their 17 atmospheric zones. And then the Vralkeen delegation rose from their seats, all 12 of them, and they raised their primary limbs in the formal Vralkeen salute that Elena knew from her studies was reserved exclusively for recognized apex predators. A salute that had never once in recorded history been directed at a human being. The Gorvathi delegation followed, rising with a synchronized movement that made the floor tremble. And then the Draconi, furnaces flaring bright enough to cast shadows across the chamber. And then the Nytheri, phasing into full visibility so that they could be seen showing their respect. And then species after species rose and saluted, or bowed, or vibrated, or flashed, or performed whatever gesture their biology used to say, "We see you, and we acknowledge what you are." Elena stood in the center of it all and did not cry, because she had learned from the Gorvathi that tears were for when you were alone, and this moment belonged to everyone. She returned to Division Ikrath 9 1 week later, walking through the docking bay of Outpost Fang, with the same duffel bag over one shoulder, and the same medkit over the other. And the same smell hit her. The animal musk and the ozone, and the sweet rotten undertone. And this time it smelled like home. Her new rank was pinned to her collar, a title created specifically for her by unanimous vote of the division. First Hunter, the one who finds what needs to be killed and decides how it dies. A rank that by centuries of tradition could only be held by a predator species, and the division had voted without debate that Elena qualified. Rethka met her in the corridor and looked down at her with 6 eyes that held something warmer than respect, something that in a Gorvathi was rarer than fear, something that looked very much like love. "Welcome back, First Hunter," Rethka said. "Good to be back, Warlord," Elena said, and she meant it in a way that went deeper than words. Life in the division settled into a new rhythm, and Elena trained and hunted and taught and learned, and the division became something it had never been before. Not just the most dangerous unit in the coalition, but the most cohesive. A family of monsters who had found their heart in the most unlikely place. And then one morning, a shuttle arrived at Outpost Fang, carrying a new batch of recruits, and among the Vralkeen juveniles and the Nytheri shadows. And the young Draconi, with their scales still bright, there was a human. A young woman, barely 20, standing in the docking bay with wide eyes and a trembling jaw, staring up at the monsters around her, with an expression that Elena recognized because she had worn it herself not so long ago. Elena walked up to her, scarred and steady, and the young woman looked at her and saw the Division Ikrath 9 insignia, and the first hunter rank, and the scars that told stories in a language older than words, and her eyes went even wider. Elena smiled and extended her hand. Welcome to the Monster Division. You are going to be scared every single day, and that is the point. Fear is what makes us better than anything out there. Come on, I will show you where the real monsters sit for dinner. Sketh appeared behind Elena, his shadow form flickering with an amusement that the new recruit could feel like static electricity on her skin, and the young woman stared at him with a terror she could not quite hide. Elena grinned and said, "Do not worry about him. He is harmless. It is me you should be afraid of." Sketh laughed, a sound like tearing silk, and the new recruit swallowed hard and squared her shoulders, and took Elena's hand, and followed. Behind them, Rethko watched from the corridor with all 6 eyes, and felt something she had spent her entire life believing was weakness, and now understood was the greatest strength she had ever witnessed. That evening, in a quiet office deep in the bowels of Coalition Command, an administrative clerk updated a file that had not been changed in 200 years. The entry read, Homo sapiens, classification, mid-tier generalist, threat level, moderate. And below it, in a footnote added by Warlord Rethka Gorvathi herself, in handwriting that the system had to special process, because Gorvathi's script was designed to be carved in stone. 4 lines that would be read by every military commander in the coalition for generations to come. Do not assign to non-combat roles. Do not underestimate. Do not corner. Above all, do not assume they will stop. The clerk read the footnote and shivered and saved the file and went home and locked her door and thought about what it meant that the most dangerous predator in the galaxy was afraid of a species that could not even see in the dark. And somewhere on Outpost Fang, in a mess hall that smelled like a dozen worlds, Elena Vargas sat between a shadow and a warlord, and told a joke that nobody understood and everyone laughed at, and for one moment the galaxy was a little less dark, and a little less cold, and a little less afraid, because that was what humans did. They walked into the dark, and they made it brighter, not because they were not scared, but because they were scared and they went anyway, and they kept going, and they never stopped. They never stopped.